The night Abby Merritt invited a stranger off the street into her apartment, she told herself it was just the rain. It wasn't. Abby had never been good at lying, even to herself. It was a Thursday in late November, the kind of cold that settles into your collar and stays there. She was walking home from her second shift at St. Michael's Hospital, scrubs under her coat, hair still smelling faintly of antiseptic, when she saw him. He was sitting on the concrete steps of the closed pharmacy on Dundas Street, not far from her building. No umbrella, no hat. A cut above his right eyebrow bleeding slowly into the rain, and he wasn't even flinching. Most people walked past. Abby stopped. "You're bleeding," she said. A completely obvious thing to say, but she said it anyway. The man looked up. He had dark eyes, the kind that didn't give anything away. His jacket was expensive, or had been once. Now it was soaked through and torn at the shoulder. He looked like someone who had fallen from somewhere much higher than a pharmacy step. "I'm aware," he said. His voice was low, flat. Not rude exactly, but not warm either. The voice of someone who had spent a long time not needing to be warm. Abby crouched down and looked at the cut properly. Deep enough to need cleaning, not deep enough to need stitches. She pulled the small first aid kit from her bag. She always carried one, occupational habit, and tore open an antiseptic wipe without asking permission. "This is going to sting," she said. "Everything does," he answered. She pressed the wipe to his forehead. He didn't flinch. She found that more unsettling than if he had. His name, he told her, was Thomas. No last name offered. She didn't push. She'd worked emergency triage long enough to know that people tell you what they want to tell you, and the rest comes out on its own eventually, or it doesn't. What she did push on was getting him out of the rain. Her apartment was 3 blocks away and 2 floors up in a building that smelled like old carpet and someone else's curry. It was small, 1 bedroom, a kitchen she could cross in 4 steps, a window that looked out onto a brick wall, but it was warm and it was hers, and she had earned every square foot of it herself. She didn't know why she offered. She thought about it later, many times, turning the moment over in her mind like a coin she kept finding in her pocket. Maybe it was because he reminded her, just slightly, of the patients she'd seen come through the hospital without anyone to call. Maybe it was the way he wasn't asking for anything. She'd learned that the people who most needed help were usually the ones not asking. Thomas followed her home without a word. He sat on her couch while she made tea. He drank it without comment. He didn't look around her apartment the way most guests did, taking inventory, absorbing details. He looked at his own hands, mostly. She noticed they were clean, unnaturally clean for someone who'd been sitting in the rain. She gave him the couch and went to bed, and lay there listening to the rain on the window, wondering what on earth she had just done. He was still there in the morning. He'd folded the blanket she'd given him into a precise rectangle and set it on the armrest. He was standing at her window with a mug of coffee. He'd found the coffee maker himself, looking out at the brick wall as though it were a view worth studying. "You don't have to leave right away," Abby said, because he looked like he was calculating whether he did. Thomas turned. In the morning light, without the rain and the blood, he was striking in a way that was almost inconvenient. Sharp jaw, tired eyes, the kind of face that had probably stopped being easy to look at years ago and he'd since stopped noticing. "You don't know me," he said. "No," she agreed. "Coffee's good, by the way." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of one, like a reflex he'd forgotten he had. He stayed for 3 days. Abby still wasn't sure how it happened. She'd gone to her shifts, come home, and found him there each time. Not idle, not helpless, but useful in the quiet, specific way of someone who'd grown up knowing how things worked. He fixed the kitchen tap she'd been meaning to call the super about for 4 months. He replaced the burnt-out bulb in the hallway. He refolded her couch blanket every morning with that same mathematical precision. They talked, not about much at first. The weather, the neighborhood, whether the Lebanese place on the corner was actually open past 10. Then gradually more. She told him about nursing school, about her mum's illness 2 years ago and the debt it had left behind, about how she'd chosen St. Michael's specifically because it was the hospital where the nurses had sat with her mother at the end when Abby couldn't be there. Thomas listened the way very few people listened. Completely. No phone, no glancing away. Like what she was saying mattered and he was making sure not to miss any of it. He told her very little in return. He was careful with personal details the way some people were careful with money. Spending just enough to keep the conversation moving, never more. He'd grown up in Ontario, he said. His family was complicated. He'd been walking that night because he'd needed to think, and the thinking had gone badly. She didn't ask what he'd needed to think about, but she noticed that when his phone buzzed, which it did, frequently, silently, he turned the screen face down without looking at it. On the third night, she asked directly, "Thomas, are you okay?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a streetcar went past, its light sweeping briefly across the ceiling. "Not particularly," he said, "but I think I might be getting there." She believed him. She wasn't sure why, but she did. He left the next morning. She found a note on the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker, written on the back of one of her grocery lists in handwriting that was small and exact. "Thank you for the couch, and the tea, and the rest." No number, no last name. Just Thomas. Abby told herself that was fine. People came through. That was the nature of emergency medicine and, she supposed, the nature of life in a city. She went back to her shifts and her rent and the Lebanese place on the corner, and she tried not to think about him. She mostly failed. 6 weeks later, a woman named Harriet from the hospital's donor relations office stopped Abby in the hallway and told her, with barely contained excitement, that St. Michael's had just received the largest private donation in its history. A new emergency wing. Full funding. No strings attached. The donor, Harriet said, had asked for anonymity, but he'd left one condition: that a specific nurse on the emergency ward be given a formal commendation for patient care. The name on the file was Abigail Merritt. Abby stood in that hallway for a long time after Harriet left. She thought about a man who'd looked at his own hands like he was remembering where they'd been. She thought about a precisely folded blanket and coffee made, without being asked, and eyes that were careful the way someone's eyes got when they'd learned to be careful. She thought about a note with no last name. The hospital gala was 4 weeks after that. Abby almost didn't go. She owned one dress that was appropriate for the occasion. Navy, she'd bought it for her nursing school graduation, and she spent 20 minutes in front of her bathroom mirror arguing with herself before she put it on. The venue was the Fairmont Royal York downtown, all gold light and high ceilings. Abby felt immediately, acutely aware of her grocery list budget and her subway token shoes, which were nice but not $300 heels nice. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and stood near the windows and watched the room. She saw him before he saw her. Thomas was across the room, in a dark suit that fit the way expensive things did, talking to two men who had the specific body language of people who wanted something from him. He was listening to them with that same absolute stillness she'd seen on her couch, but there was something different about him here. Something formal, a gravity that had been muted in her apartment and was now fully visible, like furniture covered in sheets that had finally been pulled off. Then he looked up and saw her. The two men kept talking. He stopped hearing them. He crossed the room. It took him a while. People kept stopping him, touching his arm, saying his name, and in those minutes, Abby had ample time to understand several things simultaneously. She understood why he hadn't given her his last name. She understood the phone he'd kept face down. She understood the hands that were too clean. And she understood, with a clarity that was almost funny in how late it arrived, that the man who had slept on her couch and fixed her kitchen tap was Thomas Caldwell. Thomas Aldous Caldwell, as every business section in Canada had called him at some point. Founder of Caldwell Group, which held interests in commercial real estate across 6 provinces and was currently valued at something her brain declined to process in specific numbers. He stopped in front of her. Up close, he looked exactly the same as he had on the pharmacy steps, like someone trying to figure out what he was allowed to need. "Abby," he said. "You fixed my tap," she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite embarrassment, something softer than that. "I did," he said. "You didn't have to do any of that," she said. "The donation, the commendation, you didn't owe me anything." "I know," he said. "That's not why I did it." Around them, the gala continued its expensive murmur. Neither of them paid it any attention. "Then why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. She'd learned, in 3 days on her couch, that his quiets meant he was choosing words carefully rather than not having them. "I've been running Caldwell Group since I was 28, he said finally. 17 years. In that time, I've had a lot of people be kind to me. Generous, accommodating, helpful. A pause. I've never once had someone just hand me a cup of tea and not want anything back. Abby thought about the grocery list note, the folded blanket, the cut above his eye that he hadn't flinched at. "You looked like you needed tea," she said. "I needed more than tea," he said. But tea was a reasonable place to start. She looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, she could see a woman in a red dress glaring in their direction with the specific intensity of someone who considered herself to have prior claim on a room. She filed that away for later. "What were you thinking about?" she asked. "That night. You said you'd been walking because the thinking had gone badly." Thomas glanced down briefly. "My father died 8 months ago. He left the company to me in a way that was complicated. There were conditions. A board that had been waiting 15 years to unseat me. A deal that was being pulled apart by people I'd trusted." He looked back up. "And I'd just walked out of an engagement. 3 days before the wedding." Abby blinked. 3 days. She was better suited to the company than to me, he said. "I knew it, and she knew it. We'd just taken a long time to say so." The woman in the red dress, Abby now noticed, was the most elegant person in the room and was very deliberately not looking at Thomas while looking at Thomas. "Is that her?" Abby asked. Thomas glanced back briefly. "That's Vivian. Yes, she looks angry. She's usually angry. She's also the best contract lawyer I've ever worked with, which is a separate matter. Does she know you spent 3 days on a nurse's couch on Dundas Street?" "No one knows that," he said. "Except you." There was a beat. The gala swelled around them, a string quartet somewhere, the sound of polished laughter, the weight of old money doing what old money did. "I'd like to take you to dinner," Thomas said. "Not here. Somewhere small. Somewhere you'd actually want to eat. The Lebanese place on the corner of my street has a table by the window," Abby said. "It's not fancy. The chairs don't match." He almost smiled again. She was getting better at recognizing the shape of it. "That sounds exactly right," he said. What Abby did not yet know, what she would not know for another 3 weeks, when Thomas finally told her over the mismatched chairs and lamb shawarma she'd had approximately 40 times before, was that it was not coincidence that had brought him to the steps of that pharmacy on Dundas Street. St. Michael's Hospital was 6 blocks away. Caldwell Group had been quietly and anonymously funding its emergency department for 4 years. Thomas had been walking the neighborhood that night because he was trying to decide whether to pull the funding. Not because he wanted to, but because a hostile faction of his board had placed it on a list of expenditures to be cut as part of a restructuring proposal, and he had not yet found a way to stop them that didn't cost him more than he could afford to lose. He'd sat down on those steps because he was tired. Not the tired that came from meetings or spreadsheets or 17 years of carrying something too large for one person. The other kind. The kind that settled in behind your eyes when you couldn't remember why you'd started. And then a woman in hospital scrubs had stopped in the rain and said, "You're bleeding," and pressed an antiseptic wipe to his face without asking permission, and had looked at him. Not at his last name, not at his company, not at what he might be worth, and had seen a person who needed tea. He'd kept the funding. He'd found the leverage he needed with the board 2 weeks later, in a clause buried in a secondary partnership agreement that his father's own lawyers had drafted, and never expected anyone to read carefully. Thomas read everything carefully. The hostile faction was now considerably less hostile. Vivienne, despite her feelings about the engagement, had handled the legal work with her customary precision and had informed Thomas afterward, over the phone and entirely without warmth, that he had done the right thing. He told Abby all of this over the shawarma. He told her about his father, who had built Caldwell Group from 2 rental properties in Kingston, and one unshakable belief that the work meant something. He told her about learning to read a lease agreement at 12, and a balance sheet at 15, and how neither of those things had taught him to talk to people the way they deserved to be talked to. He told her about the engagement, and what it had cost both of them, and how he and Vivienne had arrived, eventually, at something that was not quite friendship but was functional and honest, which he'd come to believe was worth more than most things. Abby listened. She told him about her mother again. More this time, the parts she didn't usually tell, the late nights and the forms and the specific loneliness of loving someone through an illness that nobody around you could fully see. She told him about a younger brother in Sudbury who called on Sundays and sometimes didn't, and she'd learned to tell the difference. She told him that she'd almost quit nursing twice, both times in the same winter, and both times had gone back because she couldn't think of anything else she'd rather be doing instead. That's what it feels like when you've found the right thing, Thomas said. Is running Caldwell Group the right thing? She asked. He considered it seriously, which she appreciated. Parts of it, he said. Less of it than it used to be. More of it than I expected lately. He looked at her. I think the question I hadn't figured out how to ask was whether the right thing could be more than one thing at once. The chairs didn't match. The window was fogged at the edges from the cold outside. The couple at the next table were having a quiet argument about something domestic and ongoing. It was, Abby thought, the least romantic restaurant setting she had ever been in. And she was having a better time than she'd had anywhere in years. The board meeting happened 6 days later. Abby knew about it because Thomas told her. He'd started telling her things, which she was still adjusting to, the casualness of it, the trust implied. And she knew it was the formal vote on the restructuring proposal, the one that would determine whether his position was as secure as he needed it to be to do the things he intended to do. She didn't hear from him for most of that day. She worked her shift. She discharged 2 patients, helped stabilize a third, ate a sandwich in the break room at 2 in the afternoon, and tried not to check her phone in a way that would be visible to her colleague Priya, who was extremely perceptive and had already raised an eyebrow twice. At 7:15 her phone buzzed. Done. We won. Dinner this week? And then, after a pause of approximately 40 seconds, I know I'm not easy to know. I've been told that. I think I might be getting better at it. I wanted to say that. Abby stood in the break room and read it twice. She typed back. You fixed my tap without being asked. You're not as hard to know as you think. The 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice before his reply came through. Thursday? She typed. The Lebanese place. He typed, obviously. She put her phone away and went back to work. It was not the most cinematic moment of her life. There was no music. Priya was definitely watching. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and someone's reheated soup, and the fluorescent light above the sink had been flickering for a week. But Abby had spent enough time in rooms where things actually mattered to know that the rooms where things actually mattered rarely looked like the movies said they did. They looked like this. Ordinary, a little tired, real. She went home that night through the cold and the dark, past the pharmacy on Dundas Street where she'd stopped in the rain 2 months ago, and she thought about the word obviously, and what it meant when a man who had spent 17 years building walls used it like that. Casually, easily, like a door he'd decided to leave open. She thought it meant something considerable. Thomas told her he loved her on a Sunday in February on her couch, with the gray light coming through the window and a documentary about Arctic birds playing quietly on the television that neither of them was watching. He said it the way he did most things, directly without preamble, as though he'd calculated the risk and decided to take it anyway. I love you, he said. I wanted to say so before I lost my nerve. I don't lose my nerve often, which means when it starts to go, I need to move quickly. Abby looked at him. She thought about a man sitting in the rain not flinching. She thought about coffee made without being asked, and a note on the back of a grocery list, and thank you for the rest, and the particular way he went still when she was talking, like everything else could wait. I love you too, she said. I've known for a while. How long? He asked. She considered. The blanket, she said. He frowned slightly. The blanket. You folded it every morning, like it mattered, like even if everything else was uncertain, that was something you could do right. She paused. People who fold blankets like that, they're trying. I trust people who are trying. Thomas was quiet for a moment. The Arctic birds made their Arctic sounds. That's an unusual metric, he said. It works for me, she said. He reached over and took her hand in his, and his grip was certain and unhurried, and outside the window the February sky was doing something almost like clearing. They were married the following October in a small ceremony at a restaurant in the annex. Mismatched chairs, window seats, no dress code, the kind of evening where the people who mattered could relax enough to be themselves. Vivian attended, in a dress the color of good litigation, and gave a toast that was precise and dry, and at the very end, unexpectedly warm. Abby's brother came down from Sudbury and cried through the ceremony in a way that he insisted afterward was allergies. Priya sat in the front row and said, I knew it to no one, in particular at least 3 times. Thomas's speech was short. He was not a man who believed in wasting words on things that could be said plainly. He said that he had spent a long time confusing being self-sufficient with being strong. He said that he had sat on a set of concrete steps in November, with a cut above his eye, and the absolute conviction that he had exhausted his capacity for needing anything, and that a woman with a first aid kit and no patience for letting a person bleed in the rain had quietly dismantled that conviction without appearing to try. He said that being known by someone, really known, without the name or the company or the position attached, was the thing he had not known how to want, and that wanting it, once he'd started, had turned out to be the most sensible thing he'd ever done. He said she had handed him tea like he was worth the trouble, and it had turned out that he was. Abby listened to all of this and did not cry, because she was a nurse and she was practical, and also because she had known most of it already in the way you know things you felt before you've heard them said. But she held his hand through all of it, and when it was done she leaned close and said quietly, so only he could hear, "For what it's worth, you were never as difficult to know as you thought." He looked at her, and this time the smile came fully, unhurried and unguarded, the real thing, the one she'd been catching glimpses of since November, since rain and antiseptic and a stranger on a step who had needed, more than anything, for someone to simply stop,